your way back. Thank you for joining us. I'm very excited to be introducing myself, I guess, as the moderator for this panel. My name is Amy Stepanovic. If you don't know, I think I said that at the beginning, but maybe not. Good afternoon, morning, evening, whatever time it is from where you're joining us from. Welcome back from the break. I am really excited to moderate the panel of speakers that we have today to talk about the role of data in our conversations around trust. Across this event, the last day and a half, we've touched on a lot of the different ways that trust and data intersect, from issues on privacy to cybersecurity, questions about discrimination, access, governance. I think we see questions about data cut across nearly the entire technology ecosystem. So joining me to provide their expertise on this issue, I have an awesome panel alphabetically. We have Chris Lewis, who is the president and CEO of Public Knowledge. Erica Brown-Lee, Senior Vice President and Assistant General Counsel on Global Privacy and Cyber Advocacy at MasterCard. Hugo Teufel, Chief Privacy Officer at Lumen Technologies. Sarah Holland, Public Policy Manager at Google. And Sylvie Delacroix, Professor in Law and Ethics at the University of Birmingham. So I'm going to turn to all of you in turn with a really simple question. I think yesterday there was an interesting dichotomy that started to evolve, which was marketplace trust, looking at the industry, versus business trust, looking at a single entity. And so potentially in the order I introduced you, my provocative question to start off the panel is either looking at the marketplace or the business, do people trust your industry, the place that you're coming from? And why do you think that is? So Chris, I think I'm turning to you to start us off.
Okay, thanks, Amy. I'm excited to be with this awesome group here. And I feel like I'm going to start off on a real negative note, because my simple answer to that question is absolutely not. I mean, so I work at Public Knowledge. We're a public interest advocacy group, and we don't represent any particular industry or sector, but we do look at how consumers are being treated in the marketplace. And we have a lot of concerns around how they're being treated and the level of trust that they can have in industry players right now, whether you're talking about network providers who consumers have very few choices in the marketplace, so they don't have a lot of places to go. The FCC data shows that 80% of consumers, if you're looking at truly high-speed networks of 100 megabytes per second, most consumers in the US at least, 80% of them only have a choice of one or maybe two providers. And those providers are increasingly raising their costs, but they're also using data and data limits to artificially increase costs on consumers. Hashtag restore net neutrality. So the costs are going up on consumers. Their alternatives are not there for them to make choices in the marketplace. And when they do make choices in the marketplace, especially when it comes to platforms, most consumers feel unempowered, I think is the real word. There is no digital privacy law in the United States, of course. And so everything is conducted through oversight by the companies themselves. There is a lack of digital literacy about cybersecurity for sure, but digital literacy generally. And so folks are left to either trust that they're being treated fairly, or they're often just uninformed about how technology works, even though they're integrating it more and more into their lives because they feel like they have to. All conversation is happening online, whether it's in social media or whether it's essential parts of our lives like education or healthcare. I just went this morning and got a COVID test because the only place I can sign up for it is online. And it's I think even worse in communities where you have marginalized communities, Black and brown communities, low-income communities, where they're more likely to have systemic use of data harm them Algorithms are used in ways that unfortunately are still reinforcing societal stereotypes and societal biases. And consumers don't have a window or any accountability system into those algorithmic decisions that are being made. People know they're being tracked, but they don't really know what to do about it. They feel unempowered about it, and really don't feel like they have the choice to opt out from that data collection. So I think there's generally a sense of unempoweredness, and I think that breeds great distrust.
Well, on that happy note, I think I'll turn over to Erica to chime in.
Yes. Well, thank you, and thank you, Amy, for organizing the panel. It's a great question. Trust issue. I mean, I think like all financial.
Erica, your audio is fading in and out a little bit.
Oh, can you hear me now? Is it better?
That sounds better.
Okay. I'm turning it up. Does that work? Yeah. Okay.
You're on mute.
Okay. So is that better?
I think so. Fingers crossed.
It's like it's like the classic, Zoom situation here. But okay. So, I think it's safe to say for companies like in the financial services that we're all in the trust business, right? Consumers need to trust our brands, but also trust that we are going to be good stewards with their data. And as Chris is pointing out, trust is becoming more and more important. We don't have a digitization law in the country, but nonetheless, we continue that march towards our digital footprint. Really, that's only increased over the past year in the wake of the pandemic. But nonetheless, that's really still the important factor here, which is that data is, it's critical to maintain that data flow, to have the fuel to spur innovation, a number of benefit from the value extracted. So, with that idea and foundation in mind, we have memorialized our practices with regard to data, and MasterCard has created the Data Responsibility Initiative, which is a public commitment to uphold data practices and basically focusing around and coalescing around 4 core beliefs. One is that individuals own their data. 2 is that individuals have that the use of their data should benefit them, and
Erica, I think we're losing you just a little bit.
Am I there now?
Oh, you're back.
Okay. So maybe I'll try to switch to another one. But hopefully the data principles I mentioned came across, the 4 beliefs. Is that, you guys can hear me.
Why don't we give you a second if you have like a pair of headphones, or if you want to switch, and then I'll come back around to talk about your four commitments again, so we don't lose them. I don't want to lose that part.
Thank you.
Hugo, you are next on my list.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Amy. It's great to be here. It's a great panel. I'm humbled by my fellow panelists. Just a couple of thoughts. I do think that our customers trust us. I agree that there is a lot of distrust with the tech industry, and I think that stems from the ways in which the industry, and I'm not speaking about our company, but generally about tech companies, that there is distrust among the public with tech companies because of the ways in which tech companies have used information, and perhaps the use of that information was something that, had there been better notice and perhaps even consent, would have been acceptable, and in other situations by any reasonable viewing would be considered a misuse of data. And so there is distrust. I think the other concern among public with the public perception of the tech industry is that there is content moderation and perhaps silencing of different opinions. Now, there are good reasons for why the tech industry and certainly social media platforms are doing so, but that in itself brings about voices that think that perhaps the decisions are based on politics or ideology. And so that is perhaps why there is an erosion of trust in the tech industry.
Moving on to Sarah.
Hello, thank you for having me on this panel and at this awesome conference. It's so nice to also have one that really puts students first and foremost. So I'm looking forward to the student question at the end of this panel. But my name is Sarah Holland. I'm with Google, as Amy said, and I specialize in privacy, responsible use, and data governance issues. To answer the question, I'll be a little bit more optimistic than Chris Lewis, which should surprise no one, is that I do think people still trust Google. I think it remains one of the most trusted companies, yet expectations, rightly, are higher than they have ever been. I think there are concerns about whether or not companies like Google are rising to meet the challenge of these new expectations. This is both in terms of product operations, right? The features that people rely on. What seems commonplace today was magic 10 years ago, but also in terms of privacy, in terms of control, in terms of needing to do less of the control themselves and more of having like the privacy and security kind of taken care of as well. But then also there's other issues far outside my expertise, like content moderation and things like that, that are also driving this. So that's not lost on me. That's not lost on anyone at Google. And I hope that what you'll see throughout this year and previous years, but more to come, is continuing announcements from us, both to show better privacy and security controls, the things that can be in the background, but also the controls that people have in order to manage their experience with Google. And that those will be even easier, right? I always think about, can I explain it to my mother over the phone where she can use it, as well as, you know, an everyday user, and that it works across all populations and all their lived experiences. But we're just one company. We may be a large company in the discourse, but we are just one company. And I think that a common theme that you'll probably hear from this panel is that we very much need a comprehensive, credible federal privacy law in this country. It's far too long that we've gone without one. And while that may have worked for a lot of people or entities a couple of years ago, I think with these rising expectations, that's no longer the case. And I think that that will really, if that applies to everyone, not just tech companies, but quite literally everyone that processes data, and that we all have those rules of the road about protecting that data and giving those controls, I think you'll see continued increased trust.
Wonderful. And then to Sylvie.
Well, thank you. And that was very interesting to listen to. I suppose I should bounce on. So on one hand, Chris is saying that people feel disempowered, spoke to me. And then I've been listening to each of you. It's very interesting to see these different perspectives. And I feel like maybe the first thing to say is really when you talk about trust and you talk about trust of institutions or organizations, you really have to ask yourself what makes an institution or organization trustworthy. That's the really interesting question. Yeah, you don't ask that question when you talk of trusting someone like my neighbor. But when you talk of an institution, yes, you want to ask what makes it trustworthy. And I think at the moment, you can't answer that question without taking the bigger picture. And the bigger picture, to me, is unfortunately not positive yet, in the sense that we just don't yet have the kind of data infrastructure that means we can assert with confidence that yes, our trust is warranted when it comes to trusting whether it's a commercial entity or a public entity. And so what I mean by data infrastructure is actually precisely these bottom-up empowerment structures that would answer Chris Lewis' worries. So I think at the moment we suffer from a very lopsided governance structure where we have a lot of, well, we have emerging top-down solutions, the GDPR in Europe. In the US, there are calls for hopefully a federal intervention sooner than later. And that's super important, don't get me wrong. Yes, so we do need top-down interventions. But unless we also have bottom-up empowerment structures, we are not going to get the kind of answer that we would all like to hear, that yes, organizations deserve our trust. Yes, and so I think trust when it comes to data in particular really requires bottom-up empowerment structures. And I've been working on data trust as one type of institution that could empower people from the bottom up because it provides particular levels of safeguards. But this is one entity among others. There are data corps, other types of entities. But what I want to say at this stage is really that I think we underestimate the fact that when it comes to data and trust, there is also a political component, and that has been misunderstood, I think. And when you think of 19th century land societies, for instance, the fact that at the end of the 19th century, people didn't have the right to vote unless they had a piece of land with a freehold title. So what did people do? They bought a piece of land, which they then cut into small parcels. And instead of having one person having the right to vote, you had 500 people having the right to vote. And I think when it comes to data, you also have a problem like that. You have a problem of marginalized communities just being disenfranchised from decisions about their data and about the futures that are being determined on the basis of data. And so I think we need enfranchisement structures. And that's why I call bottom-up empowerment structures. That I should stop here.
Thank you so much. Erica, do you want to finish off?
Yes, hopefully you can hear me now. Is it better?
Perfect.
Okay, great. The wonders of technology. So yeah, I was basically, I think where I left off was just sort of explaining our approach to data practices and the commitment that we've made publicly through this data responsibility initiative around these core beliefs about consumers and individuals having the right to control their data and know how it's being used and have it benefit them, and that we would also commit to protect their data. And that really flows into more specific principles where we follow. First is that there's security and privacy with regard to data. Second is that there's transparency in that individuals should have, and I think people have touched upon this, the importance of understanding, how the data, their personal information is used. And third, we have a principle under integrity, and from that, you're thinking about, making sure that the data is not used for purposes that would, result in bias. And then also, fourth, we have an innovation as another principle, again, using data for the purposes of betterment. Last, that sort of feeds into the sixth one about social benefit and social impact. So these are the principles that we follow from a corporate perspective, and that's sort of an external commitment. But internally, I think it's just as important to have, buy-in from internal stakeholders with respect to how, the data is used. And so from a privacy program, what that means is essentially privacy by design, really sort of working through these principles into the products and services and activities of the company, making sure that we're keeping those foundational beliefs always at the forefront. And so that's really how we can kind of continue that trust relationship, again, not just for the brands, but also for the data that we receive.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. I think, as I said, that was a purposefully provocative opening question. I wanted to put a lot of stakes out on the table early. So then we can then interrogate some of the ways and places people are coming from and the issues that are coming out. I heard a lot of things in there, from content moderation to security, a lot of mentions of privacy law. And Sylvia, I really loved your idea of politics and how that plays into this whole structure. And I think that's an interesting piece of this. Erica, I think I was going to turn to you to talk about how companies think about embedding trust, but I think you talked specifically about how MasterCard thinks about this and your policies and the different principles that you come about it. Do you think that's generalizable across the sector, that these are the approaches people use? Can you talk about how you've developed those policies a little bit?
I mean, well, so, you know, these are practices that we already deploy. But the reality is, and I think other, you know, there's been comments made about privacy laws. What we're really seeing is that shift from privacy being, you know, on the responsibility of individuals to sort of figure out how to, you know, how their data is being used and, you know, what controls they have, to companies or organizations, sort of more largely, to be the ones to determine what the risks are for the data, to mitigate the risks, to provide those meaningful tools and levers for individuals to exercise their control. You know, we saw it obviously, you know, with the GDPR, but that's really come across to the US, you know, in terms of those consumer rights. It's not, you know, there's no direct replica here, of course, but from the California law, which was the CCPA, or the California Consumer Protection Act, which will now be the Consumer Rights, CPRA, you know, it's sort of an alphabet soup, to where we see that there could be a new privacy law in Virginia in the next week or two. So these concepts of sort of, you know, shifting the onus from individuals onto organizations to provide those mechanisms for transparency and for control over their data is something that, again, you know, companies can practice through principles as well, which kind of build out the mechanism for doing it. But they're also coming that we see as a shift on stateside and really across the world.
I definitely want to come back to the idea of multiple states moving in this direction. I feel like every time I turn around, there's a new state that's introduced a privacy law. It is. It's a bit of almost like one of those, you know, that analogy of when you go to the fair and you have all those horses and you sort of have a water gun and you're trying to, you know, see which one goes forward and one surges forward and then the other one goes back and the one you think is going to get and win doesn't. It feels sometimes a little bit like that, you know, just because of the sheer number of states that have considered privacy laws. And of course, you know, I know there were comments about the federal, you know, the federal movement towards a national privacy law. But so, you know, it's a little uncertain, but there's a lot coming. Absolutely. And I love that you took me back to the before days when we could actually go out and enjoy fairs. And I know, right? Remember way back when? So that's really fast. And you actually hit upon a theme that came up in the last panel of personal responsibility versus corporate responsibility, and who should the onus be on, and starting to shift it away from blaming the individual if something goes wrong. I'm going to open the conversation up a little bit, turn to Hugo and Sarah and talk about just primary ways that you all use data. For example, training algorithms, connecting with users. How do you see data being fed in, and what are the outputs that come through from that?
I defer to Sylvia on the first answer.
I can take that one and do just a quick explanation of how we use data, if that's helpful. in a couple of different ways, right? We use it to actually make the products go. I think people kind of forget the fundamentals of like data is actually necessary for product operations to check that the products are operating as intended, to improve or add new features, to create new services. Data is also used for personalization, so that could be both in terms of content or advertising. It's used for the protection of Google's products and infrastructure and for the data that we collect. It can be used for protecting our users and the public good. And then there's also that for good, I think what Erica was speaking to earlier, right? Like, can you take the data that you are using for your products, for example, and do something for societal benefit? And I think one of the most recent examples Google had was the mobility reports, where in response to the pandemic, we were taking data that we already had for our commercial services, and the analytics were all anonymous. We sprinkled in some differential privacy, which is a great privacy enhancing technique where you can add some artificial noise to your data set. And from that, we were able to give some really granular local results that helped public health agencies, governments, the public, to see how people were moving. Were they changing their mobility habits in response to lockdowns, for example, or not? Where were places busy at certain times and things like that? But I do kind of want to stop here and just say, when we talk about using data, we use data in this nice general term, but not all data is the same. And I think people also vastly overestimate how much data is personally identifiable. Like how much of that data that would be going to use products, for example, is tied back to me, Sarah Holland, or me based on populations or categories that I might be assigned to. There's so much use of de-identified data, pseudonymous data, and again, these use of these like great techniques that can make sure that not all the data is as identifiable or as risky. And I think that's really good, and that's where we see a lot more energy driving as to where you can use de-identified, pseudonymous, less identifying data the more you possibly can, while still meeting the expectations about product operations, security, and things like that. And in some instances, it's going to always be personal, right? Like my photos are personal to me, my emails are personal to me and identifying. So there's only so much that can go. But I did want to kind of, you know, as we talk about legislation or the use of data, it's not all the same. And I think that's important to hold on to and hopefully continue to push Google and others in the industry to use that less identifying data, and even better, less data, but still reaching those same kinds of insights and conclusions. So that's kind of like a nice big mix, but lots of different ways I think that you can use data. Also in terms of just general research, kind of developing these techniques and just training algorithms, but I think specifically looking at products, developing new technologies, security and protections are probably the three main categories.
Yeah, I was going to add, we use data in all the ways that every other company practically uses data: safety, security, productivity, customer service, training, compliance, marketing. The one thing that is different, I think, from the social media platforms and some of the other tech companies is that we're not into monetizing data. And I would note that monetization of data has been a big part of the growth of the global information economy, which is a great thing, right? The global information economy and global information society. But as a result of that monetization, there has perhaps been an erosion of trust by the public, governments, and regulators. So one other point that I want to make about monetization, and it relates to the rise of state privacy laws within the United States, and it could also impact a federal privacy law here in the US, and that is, what is the sale of data? And I would note that the California Consumer Privacy Act talks about the sale of data and is very broad to include selling, renting, releasing, disclosing, disseminating, making available, transferring, or otherwise communicating orally in writing or electronic by other means. So what does that really mean? And if you are a company, like a lot of companies that outsources certain aspects, that turns to a sub-processor for work, right? That either for the processing of employee data or customer data, And you're not really monetizing that data. You're just relying on a sub-processor to help you provide the goods and services to your employees or to your customers. Does that then become a sale of personal information under CCPA? And the answer is it's not clear, but maybe so. So if we're going to, for example, address that concern, then we ought to be very clear with what we mean, and that we don't impede on the regular conduct of business.
So one quick follow-up before I move on. There's so many follow-ups that I want to have, but I do want to keep the conversation moving forward. Sarah, you specifically talked about de-identified information. And one of the things I think that we've seen across the space with privacy is when lots of pieces of information go into a database, a lot of times people say it's de-identified, but it's fairly trivial to re-identify it. Do you measure that in a way? Is there a way to that you're actually engaging to prevent that from happening? I always think back to the Netflix example where they published all of the Netflix browsing history, and people were able to tell exactly what individuals that watch history led to.
Yeah, I feel like this is the time when I would like to pull in like 100 of the engineers and product managers that I work with that would be able to give you like a nice treatise on the techniques that we use and the mathematical guarantees that they can provide. I think you're right, that de-identification, there are some very famous examples of re-identification. The Netflix example, I know Professor Sweeney at Harvard has done some landmark studies on that. And I think, you know, we've seen a lot of caution about open data and this tension between you should open up data because it can be used by more people. You know, you never know what a smart data scientist can do in terms of providing a new way to solve a problem. But at the same time, when you open that data, then people can easily re-identify it. And so I think that's why you've seen like a cautious approach to that. But I think that's where those privacy enhancing techniques and those anonymization techniques can come into play of de-identifying in terms of sharing. There are certain standards, right, that are baked into law. Like I know HIPAA, for example, has a specific standard. Other regulatory frameworks have specific
Can you
standards.
say, sorry,
no
forgot to say this, no acronyms. Can you say what HIPAA is?
Yes, and I knew I shouldn't have said HIPAA because it's one of those that you always forget what it all stands for, because health data is not my expertise. And so now I'm blushing. It's health information
Portability.
I knew it's portability, not privacy. Thank you. That was a nice crowdsourced effort. That's my fault for bringing up HIPAA, and I've learned a valuable lesson.
And accountability. I love the word that accountability is in that.
Thank you. It takes a village, right, to get privacy right. So the US health privacy law, how about that? That has like a very specific standard of de-identified data. A lot of global regulatory frameworks have. So I think that you can have a regulatory guarantee and you can have a technical guarantee of de-identified, but I think, you know, Leah Kistner, a former Googler, you know, has done some really great public threads on Twitter and through IAPP about, you know, kind of like really digging into anonymization. And I think that stuff's really helpful. Is you should always, you know, kind of be pretty rigorous in terms of that. But I would just kind of point back to, it depends if you want a legal guarantee or a regulatory guarantee or a minimum standard, but there are those that exist. And I think those are really important. And, you know, for companies that have, you know, been on the, you know, the burned by doing things like opening data and then having that re-identified, or just companies where we know the protection of personal data is extremely important. Privacy, you know, is baked into like our business. And if we're not seen as having rigorous de-identifying techniques at Google, for example, that's going to greatly erode our trust and the amount of people that use our products. And that's bad for our bottom line. So for us, we have a pretty high standard. And I'll just, I think, leave it there, or else we could spend the whole panel talking about de-identified data.
So kind of for everybody, I have a couple other questions I just want to kind of use to frame the conversation. What are the guiding light documents or best practices or resources that you look to determine more proper use of data, or a division between avoiding liability versus actually going beyond what's required by law to serve best interests. What are those kind of core pieces of information that you look toward? And anybody can jump in.
The fundamentals, the fair information practices.
I love that you call them the fair information practices. I call them the fair information practices. For everybody else, frequently they're called the fair information practice principles, but I was always taught that if you call them practices, they're affirmative versus principles.
Well, aren't they both like FIPS, right? Fair information practice principles.
I mean, I think that's a great place to start, right? In the legal frameworks that exist, both that are on the books or the ones that might be more voluntary, like the cross-border privacy rules and the frameworks that you can sign up there. It's also academia, very much trying to keep pace with like papers that are coming out from legal academia, from technical academia, you know, understanding like there's a whole wide world and different ways to approach ideas. So looking to that, civil society organizations, regulators, and then lots of research that we may do on our own, but I think user research, qualitative and quantitative research is really important too, right? To understand what, and that can be specific to products or companies, that can also be looking at general populations, right? The way that privacy, a woman in South Asia, for example, may think about privacy with regard to mobile devices may be very different than how I think about privacy with regard to a mobile device. So I think there should be lots of guiding lights and not just one. FIPS is a good place to start, but I think you should never kind of stop trying to find information, both to interrogate what you're doing and to see how you can raise the bar. But I think civil society organizations, regulators, right, understanding their expectations in terms of how they're going to apply the law, conferences like this, lots of different ways to kind of get that input, but hopefully research is also a big part of that.
Yeah, and I would just add that there's kind of an operational aspect to it too, for whatever the organizational approach is. So as you're embedding privacy into products and services or activities, you're seeing how that really plays out, and that also informs, you know, some of what and how it validates the FIPS or whatever legal construct applies. And then that's also what you're using to inform the conversations or you know, consultations that are put out by regulators. So I feel like it's an iterative cycle, and so you're looking for inputs that are coming both externally and internally as you're working through operationalizing, and then that comes about as you're participating in the conversations that regulators are having or think tanks about proposing new frameworks. So I think it's iterative, and in some ways that dynamism is just sort of a fun part of privacy, right? Because they're new technologies that you know, are coming, that are just accelerating the use of data. And so, you know, it does require sort of I think a more, you know, iterative approach as opposed to static.
So Chris and Sylvie, you both talked a little bit about how more is needed, and maybe in answer to what has been put out there in response to this question, what else can be done? Chris, you provided an answer already. You said, what was it? Hashtag save net neutrality. So what are we looking for to be added to this body?
Sylvia.
Well, I mean, I've been trying to hold back from jumping in earlier, because actually this is so listening to the conversation so far, I'm struck by something that I hadn't been struck by before, and it's the extent to which, you know, we all know that there are two big types of conversation when it comes to privacy, to simplify, right? There are those who really worry about protecting us from the vulnerabilities we encounter when we go online, and that's super important, right? That's one side. Then the other side, again, super important, we worry about all the big important social goods that we are not achieving because we are not sharing data as well as we could, or as importantly, as responsibly as we could. So these are two big concerns. The problem, in my view, is that they're too often separated and they are kept in separate conversations. And what I'm struck by listening here is the extent to which, every time people mention this notion of de-identified data and how much we can give guarantees that the data is de-identified and to what extent, etc. This strikes me as a bad starting point, because it's basically saying, look, it's okay, don't worry, we know you're vulnerable, but we're going to reduce this vulnerability by, for instance, de-identifying the data that you leak on a daily basis by going wherever. The problem I have here is that someone, I think in the conversation, mentioned the fact that there are these important social goods, like Sarah, you mentioned the really important Google initiative, releasing this data set that meant we could help to some extent COVID efforts. Now that's super important, nobody's going to deny that. But why is it the case that people themselves can't have a say or make these important social goods achievable as a community? Yeah, and so this is my worry. My worry is that it's not good enough to say, it's okay, you're not too vulnerable because we're de-identifying the data. And it's okay, we are worrying about those social goods, we as a company, and we are releasing important data sets. I don't think that's good enough. Why is it not good enough? Because, as I was saying earlier, these decisions that rely on data have a big, important political component. We're talking about futures here, important decisions relying on data. And so why should it be separated? This logic that it's okay as long as data is de-identified is not a good logic. And I think that's why you need bottom-up empowerment structures. Yeah, and it doesn't mean that businesses like Google can't do their business. They can, but you need these structures that mean that people like you and I can actually join potentially a very big data trust and say to a data trustee, look, you set the terms according to which your data can be used or de-identified, etc. And we have a say on how we achieve important social goods, like COVID research, for instance, and we can participate in these important decisions. So that's what I wanted to say.
So we are 100% going to explore data trust. I want everybody to know in the audience who's listening, this is a conversation we're going to get to very, very soon. Chris, go ahead. I know I interrupted you.
No, I'm excited for the data trust conversation too. I guess my answer is, to go along with what Sylvie said, is that we have to remember the different dynamics at play with data and its use, the power dynamics, the market dynamics, and that makes me think that, for all the work and the thinking that's going on, and there is, good work and thinking going on in industry, we have to remember that they're still motivated by the bottom line. And so, and there's also, as Sylvie said, great benefits coming from the use of data, coming from industry. And so, in order to balance that out, I think we have to have just greater accountability systems. I often feel like I turn very quickly to government oversight, but I think it's incredibly important because as much as civil society groups like Public Knowledge, enjoy nerding out with tech companies about their new products and their practices, we're not built to be a regulator for tech companies. And so we engage, and Sarah's example about both the mobility work from Google, I would add in the contact tracing work that they and Apple did, was in consultation with many civil society groups like ours, and we were able to raise concerns, but there simply isn't the depth of expertise that you could invest in at the government level to take the place of what feels like a Band-Aid when civil society groups weigh in, and to have that expertise that then we representing the public and the public at large can turn to for accountability. So think of what's going on with the pandemic right now and the CDC. The CDC has developed a reputation over decades and decades of great work that when they say something is safe, people trust it. The same can happen with data privacy and data health, as well as the ability for trusted sources like a CDC for data, a digital regulator, to when they say something to the public follows it. And so we can continue to raise the digital literacy that the public has about cybersecurity and other practices. I agree. I think we're heading in the right path where we don't put the blame on the individual, but it doesn't mean that there isn't a baseline level of knowledge that needs to be had by the public in order to evaluate the choices that they have in the marketplace with these companies and the practices that they're using. So data privacy law, accountability, an agency with the power, authority, and skills and resources to do that accountability work. I think that would empower and educate the public well. I think we need to recognize the nexus of like the pure privacy data conversation that we're having with other policy areas, whether it's separate but I think related efforts to look at competition in the marketplace. When I mentioned net neutrality, I wanted to make sure that we understand that the data usage is used by a lot of companies, not just social media companies, and it has an impact on the affordability to consumers and the costs of keeping yourself secure, of controlling your data, of feeling empowered, can go up if we're creating systems where people have to pay for any sort of protection, and or if people leverage their wealth to protect them. There's so many products out there in the marketplace right now selling data protection, and if these benefits of technologies, new technologies, are going to continue, then we can't have folks feel like they're left out because they can't afford it. So we have to remember the nexus of raw data privacy rules and regulations with these other important social values. And to me, that means a public interest framing when you create a regulator, and I think that would go a long way. This work always continues. I really enjoyed the panel before us talking about devices and the ongoing standards that change as hackers and folks who mean to do harm get smarter and better. The conversation continues, and so to have an institution that people can trust, I think this is really important.
I just want to add one thing to borrow from the theme from the previous panel about yes and, like there was a lot of agreement, which was really nice. I would agree with what Sylvie and Chris said, right? And de-identification, I mentioned that just to kind of clarify, there's a spectrum here of data, but that is by no means like a silver bullet solution. And like I said, we are just one company. So even if we do continue to improve and increase trust and offer better controls and better privacy and security, it's just one, right? And ultimately, a regulator and a law should be put in place here to govern Google, but also everyone else, and to apply these rules of the road and make judgments about how privacy intersects both with different privacy between people, privacy and security, other issues like competition, intermediary liability, right? And to kind of make these value judgments around where privacy fits in with other rights and values and policy priorities that we have. So I'm optimistic about, there's better sourced data and more kind of representative of the people who the decisions are being made about. And I hope to see more of that. So I'm interested to see what Sylvie's going to talk about with data trust, but I know that there's also organizations just trying to responsibly source this data as well, because you don't want to create more vulnerabilities, right, in order to get more representative data. But I think you can achieve both of those goals.
So right before I turn to Sylvie to talk about data trust and go into a little more depth, the last question I have that's just very important to me, and I think it's anybody who knows me knows I read a lot of sci-fi. I like thinking about how the issues we're talking about today are going to impact the future and how to prevent some of the bad impact, because I think we can look ahead and think through some of the bad things that could come from if we don't get the use of data right. And so one of the things that I worry about, for example, is this idea of payday lenders for data. Like if we talk about you own your data, then we can talk about how you can sell your data, and then people who can't afford or who need quick money can actually fall at a lower end of the totem pole and have less power. We're talking about user empowerment over their futures than people who will not need and never be in that vulnerable position. And so that's one of the things that I think about is, are there any, like, I hate the framing of the what keeps you up at night, but like, are there any scenarios that actually like really worry you about the path that we're headed on?
I can go first. You just scared me, and I totally agree with what you were saying about the idea of owning your data. I think is extremely harmful for folks who are low income, and I would analogize it with like you can't give up your organs. You know, you can give up an organ, but you know, to give it up for money because you're poor would be a horrible pattern to create in society. And the same thing with your data control as well. Another one that really scares me, honestly, and you see this in a lot of local governments, is the backlash against biometric data and facial recognition. It's frightening. Quite frankly, as a Black man, you know, the use of algorithmic decision making in hiring and in decisions in the court system is frightening. You know, when facial recognition doesn't recognize us as well as others, it really scares me that something could happen to me because someone trusted an algorithm. And so this is why we need to have oversight and standards as this new technology rolls out, not to ban it or to outlaw it, but to understand it and to make it work properly.
Maybe one more answer if anybody has one.
I was going to say biometrics as well, so I'm glad you mentioned that, Chris. That's terrifying. Not terrifying, but it can be, right, in terms of like of how it's used. And I'm proud of the stance that Google took in terms of not offering it for sale, and being really thoughtful and responsible in terms of implementing it in products. But I also think the sale of data, that's, you know, we shouldn't bolster the brokerage market for data. I think people have talked about that, but also the end of anonymity, right? Like, what does the internet look like if we're no longer able to be anonymous on it? I don't know if we've fully contemplated the downstream implications of that, not just for privacy, but in terms of expression and being able to, you know, in the United States, but also incredibly important in other countries, right? So I worry about the end of anonymity as well.
All right, so I had promised that I would turn to Sylvie. We've talked a lot about user empowerment. Data trust, the formal data trust framework, has been one of the governance structures that has been proposed to better empower users. And you are an expert in that area. Could you walk us through a little bit about what that means and how those are implemented?
Sure. I mean, first I should preface with two exciting things, really. One is, this is group work. It's not me. It's a group of people, including, well, initially it was coffee conversations with Neil Lawrence, but then it's grown. There's now a so-called Data Trust Initiative based in Cambridge. And watch this space. Actually, later this month, there should be a report being published in the UK under the Ada Lovelace and UK AI Council, etc., on data stewardship structures, including data trust. So this is a big day for me, because a big month, let's say, because it's been up and down in that data trusts have been used and abused as a term. Why? Because data trust sounds great, right? Who wouldn't want data and trust? This is wonderful as a PR coup. Well, turns out it's quite important to use data trust to call something quite specific. It's a structure that relies on trust law to create a bottom-up empowerment structure that allows groups of individuals to bring together the rights they have over their data. And I insist, rights over their data, not necessarily the data itself, right? So the data itself may remain wherever it is, on the servers of Amazon, Google, wherever it is. But what matters here is that you are empowering groups of individuals to pool together the rights they have over their data. In Europe, that's the GDPR. In California, CCPA becoming whatever, and ongoing. And by pooling their rights, you effectively empower this potentially previously disenfranchised group of people to acquire a voice. A voice over what? A voice over how their data is used and for what purposes. Now, how do you acquire a voice? Well, you basically task a data trustee to exercise those rights on your behalf. And the data trustee has a fiduciary responsibility. And it's not a fiduciary responsibility just to look pretty. It's a fiduciary responsibility that's backed up by an institutional structure provided by trust law. And this is really important, right? We're not talking of a contractual structure where you're trying to impose a fiduciary duty by contract, for instance. I don't believe in this simply because contracts can be made and unmade, yeah? Trust law has evolved over centuries to provide precisely the kind of safeguards that are needed to address very specific types of vulnerabilities. So this is, in a nutshell, why I believe data trust could be a very important tool in the bag of tools, right? It's for three reasons. One is to bring together conversations about the important social goods that can be achieved via data sharing, very important. And on the other hand, conversations about protecting people from the vulnerabilities they encounter when they go online. So how can we bring together these conversations? Well, by creating bottom-up empowerment structures. But the second point why data trusts are helpful is basically saying, look, given the vulnerabilities at stake, we can't accept to rely on consent. We can do better than consent. Yeah, so GDPR is actually at the moment built upon consent. Has it helped us or has it served us well? I don't think so. I think we are all bombarded with windows asking us if we consent to this, that, or that every day. Are we really empowered to give meaningful consent? I don't think so. And so here the idea is to say, let's stop this myth that it's okay to have individuals making 10 times a day informed decisions about how their data is used. And let's create effectively what is a much needed intermediary layer between us, the data subjects, and them, the data controllers or data collectors. And what is this intermediary layer? It's what I would call the new profession for the 21st century, effectively. And what is that new profession? Data trustees, okay? Now, don't get me wrong. I am not trying to say that only data trust can help. There are other tools in the bag, for instance, data co-ops as well, data commons. Data trusts are specific because of the high levels of safeguards that come built in. Yeah. So because you rely on trust law, you have all sorts of guarantees that come packed in with the use of trust law. For instance, the burden of proof is reversed. So if you think that things are going wrong in the way your rights are being exercised, for instance, it's for the data trustee to demonstrate that they have acted with entire loyalty at all times. Okay. But so to recap, because I don't want to talk too long, but so what gets me passionate, and I am passionate about this idea of data trust, is those 3 points. Yeah, bringing together these two conversations, social goods and protecting people, 1. 2, doing better than consent and potentially reversing the direction of consent. And how do you do that concretely? Well, in my dream of dreams, we would have a scenario where, say, when you go shopping on Amazon, right? Some people can log in via their Facebook account. Well, here you could log in via your data trust account. And your data trust account would set up the terms and conditions according to which your data can be used and collected, reversing the direction of consent. So that's the second point. And then the third point is really that we need to empower groups. At the moment, it's very strange. Yeah, when you talk of data, it makes no sense to only focus on the individual. Most data pertains to many people. So we need to have structures that empower groups, not just individuals. And that's why I think data trust can help. I think I should stop here because it'd be much more interesting to have a conversation.
Digging around for my mute button. If anybody wants to briefly respond, otherwise I'm going to go to our questions. Well, why don't we have, oh, go ahead, Chris.
Oh, I'll just say briefly, I think this is an exciting, interesting idea to continue to study and test out. You know, there's apprehensions I have about it. Certainly, my point about accessibility for everyone to these sorts of services is a major one. And I think Sylvia's right that, you know, there isn't one silver bullet here either. You know, there's still, you know, the nexus with the use of data and competition concerns that isn't addressed by the trust system. So if you log on to Amazon with your data trust login, there's still the concern of whether or not you consumers and users are only getting a limited view of choices in the way that Amazon's been accused of collecting data and using data to edge out its competitors in their marketplace. So so we have to think about the full picture of not just data privacy, but also how it works in concert with other important consumer protections.
So we have Stacy Weber here with us on screen. We'll bring her fully on screen, and she is one of our law students, and we'll get to ask the first question under our Phil Weiser rule.
Hi, I'm Stacy. I'm a 2L. First, just thank you so much. This is an incredible gift to get to listen and to just learn so much. One of the things I've been so struck by getting to listen to these ideas is in some ways the contradiction, to get to learn so much as a student and also as a user experience the opacity or incompleteness of information and the overwhelm of realizing I do not have the capacity to manage my cookies on every page I visit. And so I've been struck by the social narrative aspect of this as well, that while there are real problems that really need solved, Scandal's really catchy. And I've been thinking about the ways that solving the problems also means like having a social framing and a social narrative that we can get some collective momentum on. So I was wondering if there's just a basic word that you think would be a helpful social frame for users, and whether that's a word of hope or a word of caution, a way to think of things as a society as we move forward, and that people can widely find accessible and relatable.
Stacy, you stumped them.
I know. Well, it's hard to just sort of come up with a single, like sort of distill it all down to a word. But, you know, one of the things that struck me as we were having this conversation is I think it is important to have sort of data inclusion. One of the things that I think that is difficult to sort of grapple with is how the disparate sort of impact it can be for data, whether it's from the consumer side access or even, you know, at the organizational level. And so, you know, and laws are sort of struggling to catch up with this. That's why we see data portability provisions. It's not the same concept as trust as the data trust, but it does give that ability to sort of, you know, extract your data and move it to another organization in a way that you choose. It does bring up questions of interoperability. You know, I think people have mentioned the aspect, the sense of, you know, the intersection of competition law. I would also put in there ethics, because I think, you know, when you inject that layer of the sort of layer in between the data controllers or the organizations and the individuals, now you sort of there is this question of how that is structured from an ethical perspective. And maybe, you know, Sylvia, you would, that your concept sort of, you know, does take into account. I mean, we could spend probably another hour talking about all of the different layers, but, you know, for me, if I had to put a word, it's one of the words I'd say, and throughout there is inclusion, but it's got to be sort of a larger tent of considerations.
I would say cautious hope. To call your elected representative and encourage them to pass federal privacy legislation would be another step. But I think one concrete thing also is just figuring out how technology can work for you in terms of where you don't have to think about privacy perhaps all the time or every day. Like we've talked about how the law is moving from putting all the pressure and responsibility on individuals to the companies. That's as it should be, right? But there also can be tools that we need to develop and have developed in order to make that a little bit easier for you. So a good one is if I let Google save my passwords, they'll let me know if they're nice and strong, if they've been compromised anywhere else on the web where that password's been used, right? That's like a nice way where I don't have to constantly be thinking about that. The other one is auto delete, which is a really cool feature where you can kind of, I don't want to sound like I'm selling a microwave on an infomercial, but you can set it and forget it, where you can you can ask Google to continuously and automatically delete your data after certain points. Now, that may mean that you're going to delete your emails, right? But that may be what you want to do. And so that can delete your location history, your web and app activity, your YouTube history. That's like really important where privacy is convenient and you're having Google do the work for you. And so I hope that we're going to continue on that path and others might continue on that path. So I want it to be where you can think about what you want in terms of your relationship and say yes and no to things and be informed about that. But that shouldn't have to be the case. And a lot of it should be done behind the scenes where, again, you're protected without having to do all the hard work.
Stacy, my watchword I already gave, but I'll give it again. It's accountability. I think it can work well with some of what Sarah was saying, but I also think it's required that you know, it's great. I think I agree that, you know, the more you think about how you need data in your life or how you use certain technologies, the more informed we can be about, you know, what we demand from an accountability system. The smarter we can be about what uses of data we want to make sure are protected. You know, Hugo's point about making sure that business can continue and we can still reap the benefits of new technology. So I think all that comes with accountability, smart, expert accountability systems.
Thank you so much, Stacy. I have a question in the chat in the Q&A from Caitlin, who is talking about balancing social good with corporate responsibilities, particularly given that a lot of jurisprudence says that a company has to weigh the shareholder good and not necessarily social responsibility. How does that mechanism, how does that consideration factor into building in some of these greater privacy protections?
Well, I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in. You know, I think that the social value is very important. And, you know, as I was saying, I think that, you know, the inclusion and inclusiveness of how you look at from the lens of your privacy tools and protections, I think absolutely weighs in. You know, obviously every organization looks at it differently in terms of how they're going to, you know, encourage the value. Sarah gave a great example of how, you know, Google is providing data. you know, for data sets for certain values. And certainly at our company, we do something very similar. I think it's just not a one-stop shop or static consideration. I think you sort of have to look at sort of behind the scenes, you know, what are the mechanisms that would be in place as you're sort of doing privacy by design and products and services to add that value to your consumers, whether it's in terms of user experience, ability to understand or make choices about the use of the data, deleting data. So I think all of those come into play as you sort of evaluate each circumstance. But as a North Star, I think it's important to just maintain that products and services should have, you know, a net benefit. But I do think that that's sort of a, you know, case by case or tool by tool analysis.
Thank you.
Can I just add in, Amy?
Sure.
Just, I mean, so the question was clearly pointed at companies, but, you know, why should a company not have, why should, I mean, it's a capitalistic society. Companies follow the bottom line. They have to make shareholders happy. Why do we need to change that if we have strong accountability systems? You know, I think it's great when companies take into account, you know, without any regulator hanging over their head, you know, to do the right thing. But I think that's, you know, in the end, it can't just be trusted. It has to be demanded. I think that's how our society is set up. And so, you know, I don't know that you necessarily should expect that from a company. You should demand it from a company using the levers of power that you have at your disposal. And, you know, I think that's what it is the interesting side of Sylvie's proposal about trust, is that at least you're setting up a legal structure where someone has a different motivation.
It's a great question. And also, how do you ensure that if a company takes a principled stance or a responsible stance and does the right thing, that they're not punished in the market, right? They may be doing it, but they're constantly fighting for market share versus other companies. And they may get left behind if they're not offering that kind of technology or that kind of data sharing. And so I think that's a really interesting question that kind of goes back to the guardrails question of, and it's something, you know, I think a lot of companies think about is like, how do we make sure that we can take this stance and not get hammered for it financially? And being able to correct those incentives, I think would be really good. But, you know, one company doing it on its own can be kind of challenging. But I think that the market's recognizing good privacy is good business, right? But again, that's one company, and I think you see sometimes companies moving in groups of 2 or 3, which is probably speaking a little bit to those dynamics.
But I don't think it has to be on different sides of the equation, right? Like you don't have to have privacy on one hand and, you know, or profit, I should say, on one hand and social good on the other. I think you can have, you know, both on the same side. And so I don't think that premise has to be true. I think you can, you know, you can have services and certainly that add value, but that also, yes, there is a, you know, a profit component to it, but that they also add value that is appreciated by the consumers as well. I just don't think that it has to be.
So I want to get to one more question and then I have to go to closing remarks. But Hugo, you started out talking about distrust in the industry, and we had a question from Cliff Harold about competency of organizations that oversee data privacy. And if we think that the overseers are trustworthy. And I'm wondering if you can tie back the people who are looking over this, either the agencies or other regulators, and if they have the resources they need on this issue.
Well, I mean, I think it depends on the industry and the regulator, but I suspect, other than maybe the Spanish Data Protection Authority that gets funded from the enforcement actions that it successfully prosecutes, I think most regulators would say that they could use more resources. That's just my guess, and from my time in government. And of course, I would guess that others on the panel would agree that there's always the concern of agency capture, that industries capture the regulators. And that's worth mentioning. I would say that I find it interesting when looking at US regulators versus European regulators as an example, that fines have been much larger here in the United States than they have been in Europe. And yet we here in the US view the regulators as being softer than the European regulators in some regards in terms of enforcement actions. And I guess the final point I would make there is that we're talking about technology. Technology changes. Laws don't change as quickly. The laws are not as nimble, and perhaps regulators are not as nimble, right? And understanding the good and the bad of emerging technologies.
So I've asked you all, I'm going to ask you to do closing remarks in a tweet. So 240 characters or less. What is the top thing that you would want people to take away from the conversation that we've had here today?
There should be multiple tools in the toolbox, and the US needs a comprehensive and credible privacy law.
Erica, I saw you go off mute.
Oh, well, I was just getting ready. I was listening to everyone else as well. I sort of said it in previous comments. I don't see privacy, and even security or social impact all on different sides, and that I see it as a united front. And I think you can have privacy add value in a socially beneficial way.
Sylvie?
Well, I think key message, given that we have students here, is future is in your hands. Actually, we can talk all day about, say, the need for data trust, data corps, etc. But what we really need are people coming up to fill this, I think, upcoming profession, data trustees, or you can call it something else if you want. But I'm not talking of a board in a company playing as intermediary. I'm talking of independent people trained with an understanding of law, an understanding of data science. That's not easy. Not enough universities are providing this kind of education. So I say, universities, you need to up your game, provide the kind of education we need. And I say to you students, don't just study law, also study data science. We desperately need people versed in both. And please consider data trustee as your next career move.
These are long tweets, folks. Kristen, Hugo.
We're not doing well.
No surprise, my tweet would be that we need to flip the power dynamic and empower average users by creating accountability systems.
The global information society and global information economy require trust to succeed.
Well, thank you all. We're actually heading into our lunch break, and we're going to have the hallway track open. If any of you want to continue these conversations, it was just put in the chat. You have to exit the Zoom, go into the hallway, but we hope that people will start talking. There were a lot of questions. This is the most questions I think we had for any panel. So you inspired a lot of thought, everybody. Thank you so very much. This has been really, really educational. I appreciate you all.
Thank you, Amy.